a really simple movement with my fingers, but that it goes through me. I'm not making it go through me. So I'm not making my wrist work, I'm not making my elbow do anything. Because if I'm making it do something, if it's going through me in a way that's making a particular pattern go through, then that closes off my options. This is something that's very deep inside of us. It's not so much skeletal. It's much more a muscular thing. Okay, so as you're lying there, keep that going, that really gentle movement. And feel the parts of you that are contacting the ground. And feel the pressure that those parts are making with the ground. So what's the part of you? And this is not necessarily the part that's got the most contact with the ground, but the part that feels heaviest or feels it has most pressure into the ground. And feel if you were gently going to try and move that a little bit across the ground. But if there's a fair bit of press going on there, it's probably not that easy to move. And then go to an area that feels as if it's making clear contact with the ground, but it's lighter. It just feels like it's not pressing. And just begin to move that area a little bit on the ground. And feel, is that a little bit easier to move? So this is what we're working with all the time when we're working with people. These ideas of press, lift, pressure. How do I help to give someone a feeling of lightness? Okay. So now, think about your head on the ground. And I want you to imagine you've got, if it feels really heavy on the ground, as if you feel there's a lot of sort of pushing back, could you get something soft under your head now? Something that you feel your head could just sort of sink into a little bit. So the image Feldenkrais uses here, and he's used different images at different times, but the one he's using here is you're going to imagine you're on a layer of compressed air. And if you can imagine that, if you were going to press a little bit into it, the air would shift. Something else. It would have to move to another part. Another image he uses in Amherst is he talks about, if any of you have ever been to the Dead Sea or in a flotation tank, that you imagine you're suspended in this liquid. So could you very gently think of pressing your head a little bit into the floor to get the sense that the floor will give to you. The floor will adapt and give to this pressure. So that your breathing stays easy. So you're just gently pressing the back of your head in directly back into the floor. It's like a vertical force is going through the back of your head into the floor. And then you release it. And then you press again, very gently, so your breathing is uninterrupted. You stay long and wide. And you begin to sense as you do this gentle press, if you were on a bed of compressed air, that another part of you, because you're displacing the air, will tend to lift a little bit away from the floor. So this gentle press back. And it's not that you're making something lift from the floor. This is not a big muscle work. Your tongue's soft and your neck's soft. You've got all of you in your image. Okay, so leave that and then let's do a shoulder. Let's say do your right shoulder and can you feel where the contact you have with the ground is? So it might probably for a lot of you won't be your shoulder, maybe it's somewhere in your shoulder blade, maybe for some of you it's more in the ribs. So wherever you already feel there's a little bit of pressure on the ground, and you're going to gently think of pressing that area back a little bit, and again the ground giving to you. The ground just gently giving way. And then you give that up and you allow it to lift a little bit away from the ground, to come back to where it was. And then you might begin to notice what lifts when I press this part of myself into the ground. And then think of the back of your right hip or your right pelvis, your hip that might not touch the ground with you, the back of your right hip, but maybe it's a little bit more central. But wherever again that already touches the ground, could you gently press that a little more into the ground, feeling that the ground gives. And you might start to feel as you do this a little bit more, this gentle press, and then allow it to lift back again, to come back to where it was. That this can give you a feeling of a little bit more length through you, a little bit more width through you, a little bit more internal space. And then could you do the same thing with your right heel or the side of your foot or whatever part is touching the ground? So the floor is giving. How do you imagine that? How do you imagine that experience of the ground gives to you? It doesn't disappear, but it gives to you. And you might notice just another part of me lift a little bit. Again, it's not with a big muscular mobilization to lift. Just a very gentle lightening of another part of you. And then your right hand. If your hand is touching, if your hand's not touching, you might want to choose your elbow. So whatever in your right arm is touching the ground. So how do we begin to get this idea that every part of us can have this anti-gravity response? It's not just something in our feet or our pelvis. It's something that's a much deeper organisation than that. If you can, yes. Okay, so now, could you do the same thing with your left side? So your left shoulder, the left back of your hip or pelvis, the left heel, and somewhere in your left arm. Just take your time. And you're curious. Is it different here? Do I understand that response a little differently in different parts of myself? But there's some parts of me that aren't as clear in my image in this function, so I maybe feel I begin to shorten or compress. So we're using the parts of ourselves that already know how to find ground, and we're clarifying this response of how do I allow the ground to soften? So then if we go a little bit to the opposite idea, which is the lift. So if we start with the back of your head, and you were going to think, I always love this, it's like we're teaching levitation. And you're going to imagine that your head could just float. Because your imagination gives you the ability to feel, what have you constructed about this in your image of yourself? that my head could float? Is that like, no? And feel if your head is going to lighten a little bit, to feel it could float a little bit. So a little bit like what you were doing with Jeff, with moving the head. What needs to go a little bit more into the ground? Because if my head's already weight-bearing, so I could do this a couple of ways. I can either press a little bit into the ground first with my head and feel, then I could lift. And again, it's a lightening, it's a floating. So that if you were in this compressed air or the water, that something would be pressing that would allow the liquid to move under your head, that would lift it a little bit. You're just displacing something. And then could you do the same thing with your shoulders? And again, you're simply curious, can I get that feeling here or not? And my thinking is free. So what would I do to float my shoulders up? What could you do to float your pelvis? So again, these aren't the big muscles doing this. This is much more your anti-gravity response. Muscles that, the very much smaller muscles that support our skeleton in space. They don't move us in space, they more support. What about lightening your heels? And maybe it's easier to think of one. Again, what has to gently find the ground to allow that? And leave that. And keeping some of that sense of you at the moment, whether it's a little bit more length and width, or your breathing, or your head feeling freer. Could you again roll to your right side? And just see, is that any easier to roll after doing that press and lift? Have you generalized something out of that learning? And bringing your left arm and leg onto the floor in front of you. And in this position, could you gently press your head? Get that same idea. Press your head into the ground or into your arm, wherever it is, whatever it's leaning on. So how would you organise it in this position? We're a totally different shape. And then maybe you could feel that the press into the ground, your breathing stays easy. That out of that press you could lift your head. It could become lighter. Maybe you could press your right shoulder into the ground. Whatever part's already making contact. So if it's not your shoulder, maybe it's something in your ribs or wherever you're making contact. Could you press your right pelvis into the ground? And again, to feel if something's pressing, something probably lifts a little bit. Maybe it's something in your head gets a little lighter, or in your leg. If we give ground to a place, but a soft groundedness, a really moving groundedness where the floor is ready to not only support us, but to allow us to move. Could you press your right arm somewhere that's already on the ground? Could you press that a little bit into the ground? And finding this sense that press gives me space. And again, you can use your right hand, gently flexing and extending to give you some feedback. Can you press your right leg into the ground? Wherever it's touching. How about if you thought of pressing your whole right side into the ground? All the parts that are already touching could all together, somehow the ground would respond and soften. And then could you use that gentle press into your right side to begin to turn your pelvis and head toward the ceiling, to maybe lighten your left arm and leg. And just notice which parts of me know the ground, which parts can I find that softness. And begin to feel that as you get this, that your pelvis starts to go down and away from you. Your pelvis starts to go down and away to allow you to roll over that underneath right hip. The weight just keeps transferring. Nothing gets stuck. Keep spreading your attention. and stay within what's interesting for you. Maybe you can lift your whole arm and your whole leg. Maybe you can get to a point where everything lifts together. So the more you find all along the right side of you to press and give to the ground, maybe it becomes easier for your whole left side to begin to lift away from the ground. And it's this quality of sensation that you can find for yourself that we're looking for in ATM. Just really staying where you're learning, where you can still make distinctions, where you're interested, and really notice if you get frustrated, what happens to your thinking? What happens to your breathing? What happens to the movements of your fingers? So all these habits we have in attending, in ideas about ourselves, what we should be able to do or not. Okay, so now roll to your back and go slowly and roll and find that same shape on your other side. Feeling that ground, your easy breathing, that you're always in. I suppose the thing I really love about this is these are the things, the lessons that after I'd gone through them a lot of times made me realize this is about how I respond to the environment. This is the ground. This is the world outside of me. How does this change finding this, my relationship to the environment around me? And once you're on your left side, we're going to imagine the movement on this side. And again, feel absolutely free, because imagination is in many ways based on our experience. So feel free. So you're going to start with some of that press and lift. And of course, our imagination fires our premotor cortex. So things are mobilized. So you're finding, in my imagination, can I find this ease? How much do I include of myself, of the sensation of what I was doing on the other side? Absolutely. Alistair's just asking me, he's waving his hand, do I still want my fingers going? No, left hand. No. So this is when we're transferring the learning. And it's the sensation that we're really interested in. But it's not just the sensation, it's that whole gestalt of that I've got the ground, I've got my breathing, I've got my shape, I've got my legs and my arms and my head and my torso. And if I haven't got them, it's absolutely fine. That's my inquiry. What parts do I often leave out? You've got this gentle flexion extension now with your left fingers. And we did lots of variations. We did all the press and lift. We did the turning of your head, the turning of your pelvis. The turning of them together. Feeling all that contact you're finding with the ground. In an unusual position that we often don't think about it as much. We're in a position where we're really asking, we're giving a chance for us to feel really longer and more open on that underneath side. And then a few times, remember, we lifted the hand and left the elbow down, and we lifted the foot and left the knee down. And again, imagining how that's going to do those subtle shifts of movement through your ribs, through the ground. That every time I transition a part of me or move it in a different way, different parts of me are going to go to the ground. Find the ground. And it's this quality that lets me give up that often habitual work I do. So that as you go on, you're imagining all of my right side lifts away from the ground, my right arm, my right leg, and I'm finding that what the underneath side of me, how it gently presses into the ground, that the ground feels soft, giving. And really feel free to do the movements if it helps. You're learning. So how much of you is in your image of the movement now? What are the bits that you feel you could still feel in a little bit? That you could come back to and do this lesson again at some stage and go, something new's woken up, something new is now getting some information up into my brain, becoming alive. Again, can you find now a way to roll to your back? And And that your neck's soft, your eyes are soft, so you can keep spreading your attention to different things, to your contact with the ground, to your breathing, to this soft flexion and extension, this ability to have inclusive attention. That more and more of me can be in my image. And to feel, once you get to your back, what's your contact with the floor like now? What is there maybe more of you? This happens after many ATMs anyway. But is there more of you in contact with the ground? So there's many ways we can come at this. Is the pressure more even? And as you begin now to make your way up to sitting and standing, can you feel that this pressure, this softness, that your pelvis can simply keep moving, and that you can lift yourself up to sitting. You can lift yourself up to standing rather than pushing yourself. And there's many ways you can come up. There's not just one, but that you can begin to feel, when do I push? When do I have to use my legs a lot? And again, it's all an approximation for you at the moment. Is there something within this that you've found just a bit more lightness? A bit more sense of having all of you in your image? How's it generalized to where the weight is on your feet? How's it generalised to your feeling of the space around you, the forward and behind, backwards and sideways and above? How's it generalised to your sense of internal space, your length and width and depth? How does these movements in gravity give us more a sense of 3D? This three-dimensionality of the world around us. Have a walk. And just give yourself a couple of minutes if you need another. I know I need a toilet break. And we're going to come back and do a little bit more in prone from what we were doing yesterday after doing this ATM.